This is James Cadigan interviewing Dr. Wilford E Powell. Dr. Powell is associated with Phillips University in Enid, Oklahoma. On this date, May the 20th, 1970, we're giving this interview from the First Methodist Church in the city of Oklahoma. Wait a minute.
Enid.
First Methodist Church in Enid, Oklahoma. Dr. Powell was a Founders Day speaker at the Phillips University on October the 9th, 1958. Dr. Powell, tell us about your place of birth and parents.
Well, I was born on the other side of the world in the small country of New Zealand. My hometown and birthplace, and where I lived for the first 22 years of my life, was the southernmost city of New Zealand, Dunedin, a settlement early made by Scotch settlers in New Zealand. There I grew up. My father was born in Australia, my mother in England, and went to New Zealand when she was 14 years old. And I lived in Dunedin for my childhood and youth. It was a city then of about 60,000. We lived in the suburbs. There were hills all around the harbor. We had a very wholesome and pleasant life. And in 1915, after I had attended the Otago Boys High School there and had gone to a good many night classes, I was interested in coming to America to continue some education for the Christian ministry. On that year, on August the 31st, I left Dunedin and was in the company of another student friend and an older friend who was a minister. We journeyed to the United States, stopping in Hawaii on the way, and I arrived at Enid, Oklahoma about 10 o'clock in the evening on a Rock Island train on October the 9th, 1915. And there I was met by a group of Phillips students and taken to a rooming place out at the Phillips campus. And there my whole adult life, my further education, and my love for Phillips, which brought me back after my graduate work, there it began. You want me to start this?
Dr. Powell, can you remember any special events which occurred in New Zealand during your boyhood? Tell us of the approximate year, if you can remember. Also, just tell us about your schools. Describe the schools at that time.
I went to a suburban school, the Caversham School, out on the edge of the city, where we had 2 years of the infant room, and then began the first standard up to the 6th standard. Those two put together correspond roughly to the 8 grades, as in schools here. We had typical British background teachers, men teachers in some of the early grades even. And I was I suppose, an average student, but I had some special interests. I used to decorate my papers with artwork. During my childhood, and I can't remember the year, we could check it, but it was during the Boer War in South Africa. The New Zealanders celebrated a famous victory of Sir Robert General Baden-Powell, the victory of Mafeking. And one thing I do remember about that is that we had a holiday, and I was hoisted on the shoulders of the students, and ever after that my nickname was Baden. And if I was to go back there and visit with some of those old-timers, they'd probably call me that now. Then I went, as I said, to the Otago Boys High School for 2 years, and in those days, there was not nearly as many people went to high school as they do now. After 2 years, you could pass an examination and go on for another 2, but I chose to go to work, and I worked in an office for the years between then and the time of my leaving. But I became interested in the church and in preaching, and it was because of that interest that I was influenced by a very dear friend to come to America. I remember being very scared about it, wondering how on earth it would be and whether I'd be accepted, and dreaming of being lonely and all that kind of thing, and life didn't turn out that way at all. I've been welcomed here and have enjoyed every minute of it from the first day.
Dr. Powell, when you arrived in Enid, can you give us some of the details, or can you describe or tell us the ones that you might remember who were community leaders in the city of Enid while you were growing up, and also tell us about your experiences at the Phillips University and how you came along in the growing up period there. Doctor?
All right. When I arrived at the station that night, I was met by this group of students, one of whom was a man by the name of Oswald Golter, who had come the previous year from Australia. And our friendship developed from that moment and has lasted through all the years since. To jump ahead, one of my retirement projects has been writing a biography of Dr. and Mrs. Golter, telling of their 30 years of missionary endeavor in China in those troubled years from 1922 to 1951. And that book has been published by Phillips and is awakening a good deal of interest. But to go back, when I got one of my early automobile rides that night, for there was someone there with one of the few cars who drove us out to the university, and I remember very distinctly my first impression in the moonlight of the 3 stark red brick buildings rising up over the prairie, and wondering what they had of my future in them. I soon found out. I was first classified as a sub-freshman, and I graduated the first year from the Phillips High School, which has long been out of existence. Then I was able to catch up in the summertime and graduated with the class of 1919. During those years, of course, Dr. Zollers, the first president, had died, and Dr. McCash, the second president, had begun his administration during my first year, 1516. There were many faculty members that gave tremendous assistance to their students. In the General Arts College, we think of Roy J. Wolfinger or Frank A. Wellman and many others. And in the Bible College, where I was enrolled, C.C. Taylor, Frank H. Marshall, the dean, and very influential in my life, Dr. Harry D. Smith, who is remembered by students still very dearly.
Dr. Powell, tell us about your leadership involvement with the Phillips University and about the problems you had and how you solved them. What was the most exciting thing which happened in your community and your activity with Phillips during your early days with the Phillips University?
Well, there were many. Perhaps I should say that I got married in 1917 and met my wife of nearly 40 years on the campus. In student activities, there were many also. I was a member of the intercollegiate debate teams, and in those days, a debate had a very high degree of student support and enthusiasm. And I have very real recollections of some of the debates when we happened to win, of being carried on the shoulders of the students, and the band playing, and the celebration something like you have now for football games. In my senior year, I was editor of the student paper, and that was the year 1819, and there were many events that year, of course. The war was on, but Armistice Day came in November. Students who had been involved in the war were returning before that year was over. And all of these events were headlined in the newspaper of the college, which at that time was called the Slate. I asked some of the alumni representatives that were back on the campus this morning, how many of them knew what the Slate was? Well, of course, the old-timers did. The present and the recent graduates know the school paper as the Haymaker. One of our regular activities was our weekend student preaching appointments. And early in my first year, I had my first experience at a little place that is now hardly on the map, but at that time was a thriving little village called Quay, Oklahoma, about 3 miles north of where Yale is now. The church I served there could only afford preaching once every 2 weeks, and the remuneration was small, but it helped mightily in those days. And we used to go out, a bunch of us, walking across the fields from East Enid north to the Frisco tracks, where there was a sign labeled Steen, S-T-E-E-N. And there the Frisco coming out from the downtown station would stop and pick us up and take us to our various places east. I used to get off the Frisco at Pawnee and wonder about the Indians that I saw there in the afternoons as I waited for my train to go down to Quay in the evening. Many students did this kind of thing, and it was both a valuable experience for the young hope-to-be minister, and also, even though the remuneration was quite small, was a great assistance in their paying their expenses in college. The last 3 years of my undergraduate work, I was minister of the Christian church at Medford in Grant County.
Dr. Powell, describe for us about your experiences in your college work at Yale University.
My work at Yale, of course, was first in the Yale Divinity School, where in those days they allowed us a full year of credit toward the divinity degree because we had taken Bible and other religious courses as undergraduates at Phillips. They don't do that anymore. So I received my BD degree in 2 years. It was a very, very enriching experience. Dean Charles Reynolds Brown, quite well known throughout the world, was the dean at that time. My major professor was Luther Allen Weigel, who for years has been a leader in interdenominational work, has been the chairman of the Standard Bible Committee, the Revised Standard Version Committee, and is a well-known figure. I was very hesitant at first, but managed to get along very well. And one of the things that contributed to my life greatly was that here, since this was a school attended by students of many different denominations, to have fellowship and understanding with them greatly enriched my life. I got my BD in 21, stayed for another year of graduate work, getting my MA in the graduate school in 1922, and then had the call to come back to the campus at Phillips and launch a new department. The new department at that time of religious education, as it was called then. I started my teaching in 1922, but I went back to Yale twice, 1925-26 and 1928-29, when I received my doctor's degree there.
Dr. Powell, what do you consider some of the most unusual experiences in this period?
Well, I began my teaching in 1922. At that time, what we called religious education was a relatively new field and was being tremendously emphasized in all the churches. It was the year that the International Council of Religious Education was organized, and there were many projects, leadership training schools, some of which went on for many, many years regularly. And in the first year of my teaching, we had a committee of ministers and organized the setup of a course in the Bible taught at the Enid High School on a new basis, not to be taught in the school buildings, because we were recognizing the separation of church and state. So the organization built a little building out across the street east from the high school. And Professor Shane, who had previously taught at Phillips, became the first teacher of this Enid High School Bible course. It was taught in this little building. He taught it for 23 years, under all kinds of difficult circumstances, because the Depression came on and made the project very difficult. But the courses in Bible were taught. One interesting thing happened. The lot on which the building was erected was sold, and we had to move the building out into the street with no place to go. Then later it was moved to the west side of the high school, but continued to be the place of teaching this course. And then it was moved south, and more recently, a church building across the street has been purchased and is now the site where the Bible course at Enid High School is taught. We had many problems with the Depression. I remember very well, we organized a salary schedule committee, and we secured the approval by the Board of Trustees of a salary schedule in 1928. That year I went away for my graduate work. And soon after I came back, the Depression had hit, and the salary schedule had to be thrust aside for the time being. It was never repudiated, and it was revived later on. Our salaries were often not paid. There were many ingenious devices created. Professor Shirley needed some dental work done, but he couldn't pay the dentist. The dentist had a daughter he wanted to send to college, but he was doubtful about paying the tuition. the school had faculty without salaries, but by pure bookwork, by crediting something to the salaries, by giving the student his tuition, by arranging it with the dentist, everybody was taken care of without any money actually passing at all.
Dr. Powell, could you relate to us some of the more recent improvements that has been made at Phillips?
Well, of course, recent means various things, but let me go back just a little bit. Of course, through the very basic administration of Dr. McCash, the effects of the Depression were felt almost all the way through. It was almost impossible for buildings to be built. In Dr. Briggs' administration, he was dedicated to changing this. And in 1947, a fire destroyed the old historic old main building, the center of the Phillips campus. And that necessitated a vigorous building program. When that fire occurred, the Marshall Bible Building, the largest, the impressive Gothic building on the campus, the basement had just been dug, and it was not until 1950 that that building was completed and was used for many of the departments and classes because Old Main had been destroyed by fire. At the same time, a science building was built. In that Marshall building, in the chapel and some of the other rooms, are the series of stained glass windows that have been visited and viewed by people from many places year after year. I had an opportunity to share in the planning of those windows, and that would be one of the very satisfying things so far as I am personally concerned. There's one small window, to just mention one, that has some connection with Oklahoma dates, a small window that has a panel for each of the dates 1889, 1893, and 1907. Each of them connected with our state's development and each of them connected with Phillips. In 1889, it shows one of our early evangelists in a baptismal service in Oklahoma City at the time of the early settlement there. In 1893, it shows Mr. Bogus riding horseback into the Cherokee Strip territory and establishing churches there. In 1907, it shows the first buildings of Phillips being built and the students coming and sitting on nail kegs and other crude seating arrangements because the building wasn't quite completed. These three dates link Oklahoma history and Phillips history in one panel.
Dr. Powell, what do you predict for the future of Phillips University and Enid, Oklahoma?
Well, I'm neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I have very deep feelings of confidence both in the community of Enid and in the school where I have spent so many of my years in service. There are problems, of course. Every educational institution has them these days, and especially a private institution supported largely by the churches. But Phillips is doing some of the most significant things it ever has done now, and Enid is growing not as rapidly perhaps as some would like, but solidly in every area. I've lived here. I've only lived at three places in all my life: in Connecticut, in New Zealand, and in Enid, Oklahoma. And if I had to choose again, I think I would make the same decision and come to Enid, Oklahoma.
Thank you, Doctor. We have just completed a most delightful interview with Dr. Wilford E Powell of the Phillips University in Enid. This is James Cadigan, your interviewing, speaking from Enid, Oklahoma.